Craig, can you open your camera?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. We're just giving our attendees a chance to join us, our webinar. We should be starting in the next few minutes. Please bear with us. Thank you.
Craig?
Good morning, everybody. I think we've reached the time to start our webinar. It's 10:05 now. I still see people joining, but they'll join us en route. And I hope most of them join before our keynote speaker presents a presentation. So my name is Craig Jansen. I'm a manager within the National School of Government, and I'll be your host today. And it is an honor to welcome you all to our webinar in collaboration with the Auditor General South Africa. And this webinar will specifically focus on material irregularities. Thank you for honoring our invitation by registering for this webinar. And I'm optimistic that we are going to have an insightful presentation from our speaker, Mr. Sibongile Lubambo, from the Auditor General South Africa, followed by some meaningful engagements thereafter. The objectives for this short webinar we're going to have today is for the head of portfolio to engage with public service officials on material irregularities. The session will create a platform for continuing strategic conversations to share the aspirations of #CultureShift2030 with the auditee space, within the auditee space. Clarify and reinforce messages shared by provincial leadership. With that two objectives in mind, we hope to have a very engaging session during the next 2 hours. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to give the principal of the National School of Government, Professor Busani, an opportunity to give some introductory comments. Thereafter, I will introduce our speaker. Over to you, Principal. All right. I think the principal will join us on our way as well. So our keynote speaker for today is Ms. Sibongile Lubambo. She is the Head of Portfolio Audit in the Office of the Auditor General of South Africa. She has extensive experience in public and private sector auditing and has been involved in the audit of some of state-owned as well as listed companies for a number of years. She is a seasoned executive with over 10 years experience. She has proven ability to drive strategic and change. She is an inspirational, transformative, and impactful leader. Sibongile thrives in advocating for the development and empowerment of young professionals. She is also dedicated to using the AGSA to make a difference and do her part in building this Africa she would like to see her children and others thrive in. With that short profile and introduction of our keynote speaker, I will then hand over to our keynote speaker, Ms. Sibongile Lubambo, Head of Portfolio at Auditor General South Africa. Thank you, Sibongile.
Good morning to all the participants who've joined us online, and thank you so much, Craig, for those warm welcoming words. I'd like to welcome the principal, Professor Busani, and thank him for really creating this platform for us to engage meaningfully, and also greet you, Craig, and the leadership from the National School of Government. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I am joined in the panel by other executives from the Auditor General who would assist in answering some of the questions in the chat. I'd like to introduce them so that when you see them answering questions, you know who they are. So we have Vanuja Maharaj, who is the Head of Portfolio. Vanuja is responsible for some of our big provinces, so the Eastern Cape, KZN, but also Mpumalanga. As Linda Leroux, who is an executive that works with us in our reporting and methodology unit. So she does a lot of the work around the MI and also helps us with the reporting. And there's Feze Kabaliso, who's the executive in charge of our unit. We call it stakeholder liaison, more constitutional stakeholders. I know that Andres is going to be joining us shortly. I haven't seen Andres on the line, but I know Andres will be joining us shortly. And thanks for the AGSA executive for joining us. Nonhlanhla, if you could just put the presentation in the presentation mode, I'll thank you so much. But look, like Mr. Craig has already said that, look, the objective of this session is to continue our strategic conversation with the leadership and the senior leadership in the different government institutions. And our understanding of that is that this continuous engagement can only help us to be better in how we lead the institutions, in how we audit as the audit institution, but also just how we manage this journey, this MI journey that we started a few years ago. So the Auditor General, Ms. Sakani Maluleka, used this platform over a year ago to start this conversation. So I'm continuing where she left off. But you'll find that I think the second thing Craig talked about is a continuation of sharing of messages that would have been shared in various platforms in the AGSA, but also by some of the provincial leadership. So it's more a continuation because we believe that through this continuous engagement, that's where we would support and find each other. What I like to, so I'll be sharing two critical parts in the presentation. The one is just the reflection on our strategy. So we call it culture shift strategy, Craig spoke about. Just at a high level, what the strategy is about. And I'm sharing that with the hope that at least you would understand where we come from as an organization. So as we share some of these messages, sometimes some of these messages attract very rigorous engagement which we appreciate. But what is important for us is that you need to at least understand why we do that. So if you understand the why, it sometimes becomes easier to help in the journey. That's the first part. The second part is then a reflection on the MI journey in terms of we've now been at it for over 3 years. What is it that we are seeing in the environment? And what are the insights that we're drawing from it? And obviously some of it would indicate things that we need to think differently about as an institution, but there's also other areas where we believe that bringing it to our attention would help you to think differently about how you respond to this material irregularity, particularly if it has been raised in your space, in your government institution. And obviously the last part, I know it's a webinar, but I also love to hear through the chat how you are experiencing this journey where you have been involved. What are the things that you really are appreciating about it? And if there's areas that you'd like us to continue to create awareness around where you feel that there's a lack of understanding. So I'd like to get those inputs because we then take them back and we help strengthen our process. The slide that is there is really about our reputational promise. And we share it in all the platforms. You probably know it by heart by now. But what we are clear about is our mandate is really coming from the Constitution, right? That we don't have any other choice but implement the mandate, constitutional mandate, to our best of our ability. But we're also clear that that mandate, it exists to strengthen the oversight, accountability, and governance in the public sector. Everything that we do, whether it's the audits that we conduct, whether it's the insights that we elevate, whether it's how we now focusing differently on service delivery, and even this MI process, at the core of it, the main objective is really to enable the leadership in those government institutions to ensure that there is accountability, but also improve the governance in those institutions. And at the oversight level is to help them, empower them with that oversight responsibility. If you could just stick on the previous slide, and then the latter part of it talks about our hope is that if we enable oversight, accountability, and governance, it would build public confidence. And it's public confidence in government's ability to deliver services, and also government's ability to do it in a way that is economically efficient and effective. And there's no other way to explain public confidence than just looking at the lived experiences of the citizens. So that's where the lived experiences come in, that if all of us are doing our job as the leaders of the various government institution and us as a Chapter 9, if the work we are doing does not result in a positive experience by the citizens, then we always have to reflect on what we're doing and look at whether there are ways we can improve. Because at the end of the day, all of the work we're doing is about delivering the much needed services. And our test of whether what we're doing is having the desired impact is through the lived reality of our citizens. And you will see that coming through in our strategy, because we are clear that as long as that doesn't happen, we always have to go to the drawing board. Which takes me to the next part where I start just giving you the next slide. We'll start talking to the strategy of the Auditor General. And you will all know that we table our reports. So we normally will table the PFMA report, which is around November, but also the MFMA report, which is around June, and lately, the real-time audits. What you normally see in the headlines, rightfully so, is the talk about the non-responsiveness of government, right? And the non-responsiveness comes from the fact that these findings would be the same year in, year out. And into some years, you'll see that there is regression in their audit outcomes, and that's what makes the news. What you don't see, which is the next slide, what you don't see, what we hardly talk about, is the lived reality of ordinary citizens. Is that the numbers that we would be talking about, whether it's the numbers around irregular expenditure or unauthorized expenditure, whether it's the findings that we talk about, You know, we talk about, if you look at last year's PFMHR, we'll have a chapter around service delivery. And we'll have observations around where there are failures in terms of how, in terms of the service delivery. And then we talk about audit outcomes, where we talk about the numbers, how many audits have been clean and so forth. What I think sometimes we don't talk about is the fact that there are people behind those numbers, and that's the impact on the lived experiences of citizens. When we talk about irregular expenditure, the conversation would talk to, but was the service delivered? What we never talk about is what is the cost of that irregular expenditure on the lived reality of ordinary citizens. If we talk about service delivery failures, where some projects are delayed for years in the end, what we never talk about is how does that impact on the individual that is waiting for an RDP house to be built, for example, or on the individual that is really waiting for a health facility to be completed so that they get the much needed healthcare and they don't have to travel long distance just to get healthcare. We never talk about that. So, and I'm just painting the context that all of us are well aware of, right? And I think that we have realized as an organization, which is a realization we've had for the long time, in the next slide. But I think we had to, when the AG came, the new AG, Ms. Sakane, and we were then figuring out, how do we navigate through the next 7 years of the tenure? One of the things we had to recognize was that this persistent pattern of regressing audit outcomes, it is impacting the confidence that the public has. Well, I did talk about the confidence the public has on government, but also on us as an institution. People are beginning to ask, what is it that as the Auditor General are doing? People are beginning to question, why are we celebrating clean audits when there is no delivery on the ground, right? Some of it is people not understanding what we do. But the one thing we are clear about as an institution is that if this continues, in the medium term and long term, it will certainly affect the relevance of this office. And we'll start having a conversation of whether we are implementing our mandate as designed in the Constitution. If you then look at the next slide, where our mandate comes from, which is the Constitution, I've spoken about it, that our mandate is a constitutional mandate, but we're also professionals. So we have a responsibility as professionals as well. Whether you look at the INTOSAI, which is the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, such as ourselves, or the resolutions from the United Nations, what is coming out clearly is the fact that it's important for the audit office, which is ourselves, to make a difference in the lived experiences in the lives of citizens. That is coming through the Constitution, the INTOSAI, and the United Nations. So it's something that we really can't debate about. It's something that is there, which is expected of us, and we need to then figure out how we do that. So what we then look at, and I'll ask Nhlanhla to move to the next slide. So after this one, so let's go to slide number 9. What we've reflected on as well is what is really the root cause of this persistence audit outcome. What is at the core of it? And one of the things that came through, even when we were consulting other documents that have been written by other borders, institutional borders. So the one that we quoted there is really from the Institute of Internal Auditors that talks about the organizational culture. That really the culture that exists in an organization is the one that determines, that drives how business is done. That culture is the one that analyzes the effectiveness of the control environment. And that control environment really supports the achievement of the organizational objectives. Because the key thing we all are clear about is that the government institutions, each one of them, have a mandate, and you exist to deliver on that mandate. And what this is telling us is that one, culture is important. The organizational culture is telling us that that culture is the one that is key in driving the effectiveness of control environment. And we're also clear that if the internal control environment is robust, it would then give the institutions a good foundation to achieve on its mandate. And the mandate is really about delivering service. So we've gotten to the conclusion that if we are to have an impact on the lived reality of citizens, one thing we need to find ways to shift is the public sector culture. So our strategy is really around shifting the public sector culture. We are aware that we don't do the work ourselves, and we can never find ourselves being in those institutions, government institutions, and driving the culture. But we had to figure out, so how do we do that? And that will take us to the next slide, which is then starting to say, what is our strategy at the core of it? What is it about? So we are committing ourselves to really making a more direct, consistent, and meaningful impact on improving the lived reality of ordinary citizens. We are aware that that's a tall ask, so it's not something that can be done in a year, but we've given ourselves 7 years to do that, part of the strategy. So we want to have a more direct, consistent, and meaningful impact on improving the lived reality of our citizens. So that's our strategic aspiration. That's what we would like to do. And I did say that we are not doing the work ourselves. So how do we do that? What is our theory? Which talks to the theory of change, that first, as an organization, we need to make sure that we are efficient. So how we do our work, we do it in an efficient way, which talks to the tools that we have as an organization. It talks to the quality of people that we have, because if you are to shift the public sector culture, the foundation of it is our people and the tools that we use. So I think the first two key areas is sustainability and efficiency. But that talks more internal. So we're clear that the best way we could shift the public sector culture is through insight. And the insights really then challenge us to think differently about what do we focus on as an audit office? Which are the areas that will be more meaningful, that would help us to then have the direct, consistent, and meaningful impact on the improvement of the lived reality of citizens. So yes, we audit, and yes, we have the value add areas that we look at, but in deciding which ones do we focus on, there has to be clarity in terms of what are the key things. And that takes into account what the government institutions are focusing on, because there's no point in us focusing in areas that are not really important or strategic importance to you. That talks to the strategic partnership between ourselves and government institutions that you are leading, all the participants around the call are leading. So we're clear that we have to think differently about how we approach our work. We also have to think differently about the timing, which talks to insight. At what point do we elevate this insight? So we have to elevate them while there's still an opportunity to course correct. For some of the work that is being done, there might not be a need to wait until the end, of the financial year and financial statements are delivered. But we need to look for opportunities to come into the space and quickly do the work, not maybe in terms of what we've done around the COVID or the KZN disaster, but look more in terms of the quick wins where we can do work, we highlight risk, we step back, we allow you an opportunity to course correct. So that talks to the insight. So we have to think differently about our products. We currently are issuing the main general reports, being the PFMA and MFMA, which is spoken about. But we're starting to think about, are there other opportunities? Because we've got a wealth of information with us. Are there other opportunities to share that information and to help you connect the dots, right? We're doing work, those of you that would be involved in the sectors, we call them sectors, but it's more like your metros, your education, the big key service delivery departments, where we are wanting to further firm up the work we've done around making sure that there's a link between what the national government does, what the provincial government does, and also how that cascades to the municipality, and make sure that chain, we see it. And where there are gaps within the chain, we bring it to the attention of those that will make the decision. So ours is to say, how do we elevate insights that, one, would help people to understand better, eliminate understanding, That would enable us to come with clear, actionable recommendations, which hopefully those would be adopted as commitments. But if not, we're hoping that you'll come up with commitments that are actionable, that we can all track and start tracking the impact that they're having. That talks to insight. The influencing part, what we had to also accept is that probably you can call it going to basics, but each and every government institution has a clear mandate, right? And that mandate is clear, whether it's in the constitution or whether it's the founding legislation or whether it's PFMA. There is clarity in terms of what do you exist to achieve as an institution. And if we can start getting the government institution to focus on that, if you are a service delivery department, at the core of what you are there for is to deliver service, right? How do we start centering the conversation around service delivery? Which would talk to influence, because we're hoping to influence the focus to the right direction. And if you are, and I'll get to it, maybe 3 slides later, where we talk about the accountability ecosystem, where you are sitting as part of a supporting department, like your National Treasury, your COPTES, and DPME, what is it that we could do differently to help government plan to better if you're a DPME? And if you're a COPTA, what is it that you can do differently to ensure that there is an impact on the local government space? And obviously, then the influence will link to the part around the accountability ecosystem, which I'll talk to it in detail. But then there's the last element, which is the enforcement. And that's the part we will focus on today around the MI, which is where within it's more an enforcement. But we're clear that that enforcement for us is the last resort. What we need to focus our attention on is really on the insight and the influence element, and to get the accountability ecosystem to work. To an extent that doesn't give us the desired result, we do have the enforcement part of our legislation, which is the extended powers, and I'll get to it. And the picture on your right is really what the picture looks like now, where you almost have, we would like to move with the shifting the public sector culture. Eventually, after the 7 years, what we would like to see is we like to see a number of government institution moving from doing harm to doing good. And the next slide will then talk about what would then doing good would look like. So we're shifting a critical mass of the what it is from doing harm to doing good. And how we define doing good is really about creating the culture that is characterized by performance. And that performance really talks to the service delivery on the ground. So if we can have all government institutions that have a culture that is characterized by performance, so it's performance. And that performance, our sense is that it's not looking at the APP now and say that I've achieved on all the targets, but we haven't spent time on what is it that we're measuring and what impact do those measures have? Because we currently have institutions where if you look at the APP or APR, the report, you're finding that they have achieved 100%. But then if you ask the question about, so what impact does that achievement have on service delivery and the reality of citizens, then the conversation changes. So for performance will be characterized by an improvement in the lived reality of citizens to one that has a service delivery at the core of it. And of course, accountability is a key thing. I did talk about our role is to enable accountability, transparency, and integrity. So when we talk about doing good, we really talk about a culture that is characterized by performance linked to service delivery, not on paper, accountability, transparency, and integrity. And the last slide, if you could just go to the slide on the accountability ecosystem. I think I've explained this one. The part I'd like to unpack is the accountability ecosystem, which is this one. What we had to piece together is to say, acknowledging that we're not going to do the work. Ours will be through insight, influence, and enforcement. Who are the role players that, if we can partner with, strategically partner with, they are in a position to create this shift. And I'll talk more about the leadership and decision makers, which is what is on my left. And the other side is more support and oversight, which I'll talk to it, but I won't dwell on it a lot. And we are clear that this accountability ecosystem, it's got different role players. There could be more role players than the ones we have here. The important thing is that all of these role players have their clear roles and responsibilities. Some of them are really clear in legislation, especially at an accounting officer level and the executive authority and the parliament. The roles and responsibilities is not something that somebody came up with, but the legislation was clear in terms of how do we then make this system of government to work together, right? So the roles and responsibilities are very distinct. Each role player has their own roles and responsibilities. But the other key element of it is they complement each other, right? So I have to do my part to enable you to do your part, which is the complementary, the fact that the roles complement each other. We all know that they say that you are as strong as your weakest link. We suggest that if there are other role players in the ecosystem that are not pulling their weight, we will struggle to see the impact, and we'll struggle to have that tangible impact or visible impact on the lived reality of the citizens. So for what we're saying is that the accountability ecosystem becomes a key lever that we all need to pull in ensuring that the experience that the citizens have from all of us changes. We are at the center of it because we also recognize that we need to partner with government in ensuring that there's this change. And that explains why the AGSA is at the center. If you start with officials, for an example, the officials that are in the different institutions, they have a very key role to play, because the transactions that happen don't happen without the involvement of the official. So it's important that when we talk about people with the right skills, we talk about integrity, we talk about people who understand what they do and how do they fit into the bigger chain, who also understand what is the impact of them not doing their job as expected. And that impact is on the lived experience of citizens. So we do need to talk about how do we professionalize government? How do we make sure that the people we hire understand what is the role of government and why it's important that even if you do a small, so there's nothing as a small job, but even if you, at the low level, the work that you do contribute positively to the achievement of the mandate of the institution. And that's important, right? And we have to ensure that everybody is in. And later on, when I get to the MI, I'll illustrate to you why those MIs materialize. It's because some of the work that needed to be done at an official level was not done. How do we make sure that the officials that we are leading do take their roles and responsibilities seriously? The next level is the senior management, right? So it's the levels just below the accounting officers and sort of at the DDG and the director level, because that's leadership level. Now, how do we make sure that they also understand the role that they need to play, from making sure that there's internal controls in place? So there has to be checks and balances, regardless of what function you are responsible for. Secondly, there has to be monitoring that happens at a senior management level, and there has to be corrective actions. So where, we talk about preventative controls, and we've issued quite a number of preventative control guides. And the objective of it was to, at least if we can highlight to senior management in terms of what are the checks and balances that you need to put in the various areas, whether it's SCM or asset management or expenditure, what are the checks and balances that needs to be in place? So it's important, and that's the role of the senior management, to put those internal controls in place and obviously monitor. And the accounting officer and accounting authority, their roles are clear in legislation. If you look at Section 38 of the PFMA and Section 51, it's quite clear on what is expected of accounting officers. And you'll have similar legislation, whether it's in MFMA or the Municipal Systems Act. That's why I was clear earlier that these roles and responsibilities are clarified in legislation. So that's obviously, we talk about the tone at the top. How do we make sure that as accounting officers, we set the right tone? In the earlier slide, we spoke about the impact that culture has in an institution. They say culture eats strategy for breakfast. In this case, it will be the mandate and service delivery, which is very important for government and is important for all of us as citizens of this country. How do we make sure that we set the right tone at the top as accounting officers? And also have monitoring mechanism to know whether the institutions we're leading are moving towards the right direction, or whether we are having an impact on service delivery. And the extent that we don't, how do we course correct? Because we're clear that we don't necessarily expect leaders to get things right all the time. When mistakes happen or errors are detected, how do we learn from it and put corrective actions in place? Part to the accounting officer's responsibilities is making sure that you've got an internal audit unit that's capacitated with skilled individuals that are independent, and that will support you as an accounting officer with ensuring that you've got a robust system of internal controls that is effective and that supports the mandate of the institution. And obviously the role of audit committee is quite clear and also helping you with that oversight role. So I've gone through those levels to indicate that all of us around this webinar, it doesn't matter at which level you're sitting, but there's a clear role that has to be played in shifting this public sector culture. I did talk about supporting departments like your National Treasury with their provincial offices, the Office of the Premier, the COCTAs, that the legislation is quite clear on what their roles and responsibilities are. And if you are in those institutions, I'll ask you to look at, if you have time, look at your annual performance plan. Look at the things that is being tracked and measured there with the lens of saying, if I were to really implement what I've put here 100%, am I accountable that that will result in a shift in how citizens are experiencing the service that I'm delivering? Or how government is performing, if you are a planning and monitoring evaluations office of the Premier, because really the objective is making sure that the province works, if you are a presidency, government works. And obviously there's an oversight. The key stakeholder, we had a meeting with one of the ministers who reminded us that the real auditors are the citizens on the ground. That's why we have active citizenry there as part of this accountability ecosystem, that the citizens do play a key role. I mean, they're the ones, so you don't have to tell them that they are safe. The citizens must feel safe. That's why we have them there. And to the extent that they don't, it tells us that there's more work to be done. As I'm closing on the strategy, I'm hoping that has given you a sense of what our strategy is about at the core of it. If you go to the next slide, and I'll illustrate how we started implementing the strategy. If you are in local government, you would have had sight of the report we issued in June around local government, which has received very positive feedback. And we've seen some, even at the president's level, and the various role players like your COCTA and National Treasury really taking our message to heart and starting the process of figuring out what do we do differently if we are to have an impact on the lived experiences of citizens. So the first one is the insight, which I did talk to you about. What is it about? So it talks about how do we then center some of our messages around service delivery, and tell a story in terms of what impact does this failures in service delivery have? I did talk about the chapter we've done last year on the key service delivery departments. If we're working for some of the key service delivery departments, you would have seen in PFMA that how we package our messages is beginning to shift. And I know that some accounting officers received our messages positively, and they could see where we're coming from, and they have made clear commitments in terms of how they shift things going forward. But there are some pockets where there's still a lot of work that we need to do so that that message is accepted. And I'm hoping that from today, you'll understand the context and you'll understand why we elevate the insights, not to get anybody in trouble, but it's really to enable accountability and oversight, as I indicated in our reputational promise. That even the quality of the general report, we even had to, for municipalities, we had to provide information at an auditee level, where if one wants to see how your institution is performing and compared with other institutions, either in the province or in the country, you're able to do that. So we really are focused and deliberate in the insights that we're elevating. And influence really talks to the ecosystem, emphasizing the role, what the legislation says your role is on the different institution, and obviously some sense in terms of what is it that we think you need to do differently. And I mean, we are able to do that because we see the entire government. We're able to pick up where there's fragmentation in terms of how government works. We're able to pick up if, even at national level, some of the national government departments who are supposed to work with each other, they're not doing that. And that's because we see the entire value chain of government, we're able to elevate that. And the part that I've circled in red is the enforcement aspect of our mandate, which I'm going to unpack in detail as I delve into the MI. And I hope those few slides have given us you a sense of what is what are our strategic aspirations, as I mentioned in the earlier slide. And to recap that our strategic aspiration is to have a stronger, more direct and consistent impact on improving the lived reality of citizens. And we're clear that we're going to do that by shifting the public sector culture. We're shifting the public sector culture through insights, influence, and enforcement. And our journey from the last MFMA and the current PFMA is starting to shape the messages towards that direction. It's still early stages. There's more work that we need to do. But what we're asking from yourself as leaders of the government institution is to really strategically partner with us in making sure that we working together, we improve these lived experiences. And the partnership will mean that let's have a conversation about what is important to you as an institution strategically, so that we can then help tailor some of the work that we do to assist you with that. It would mean that where we're elevating insights, where they don't make sense to you, let's have a conversation where we can explain and we get to a point where there is understanding from us and but also from yourself as well. But thirdly, there's clear commitments and actionable commitments that will say, how do we make sure that when we come here for the next audit, maybe things won't be perfect, but there would have been a change from where we are. So I'm really trusting that we will receive the message in the spirit in which it was created. I will now get into the MI space, which is really part of what the second part of what I'd like us to achieve. The slide is really for, I know we've spoken about it quite a number of times, just in case that you haven't had it, I'll just recap on it. We've been saying that we've been raising issues for a number of years. So we've been raising issues where there's leakages of public funds. I mean, we know that there's so much that government needs to do to meet the needs of citizens. And yet the funds that we have as a country are limited. So it's important that every rand that we have is used effectively. So we've been elevating the leakages of public funds, but we're seeing that there were only pockets where that was being dealt with decisively from a consequence management. But to a large extent, it wasn't receiving the attention that it deserved. And the recommendations will issue and we'll have an agreement in terms of we see what you're recommending, but the implementation will become an issue. So there was really no improvement. And I've spoken about the fact that the public is starting over the years now to also question what we do and our relevance. And you would have heard the fact that they're saying the Auditor General doesn't bind. And one of the responses to that was then to give us this enhanced powers, so we call them extended powers. What it is really, what is a material irregularity? What is it? So we start by, obviously, the key thing is that this material irregularity is what we would pick up as we do our work, because our main core mandate is to audit. So it's what we identify during an audit. So that is key. The second key part is that it's either a non-compliance or a contravention of legislation. So there has to be a non-compliance, contravention of legislation. Or maybe there's fraud or theft that has taken place or breach of fiduciary duty. So it's non-compliance with legislation or contravention is where there's fraud or where we've picked up fraud indicators, where there's theft or breach of fiduciary duty. So those four elements must be there. And obviously we will then be communicating that to you to say we've picked up instances of non-compliance, and we give you an opportunity to then respond to that. If there are non-compliances or this fraud or theft, what it could tell you, if I take you back to that accountability ecosystem, it will suggest that the internal controls that are there were not robust enough to prevent this non-compliance from happening. But also to the large extent, your detective controls were not strong enough to pick it up yourself. So we come as the audit team, most of the time we pick it up. I know there are instances where some institutions have robust controls, they will pick up this non-compliance, but I'm talking about the instances where it hasn't been identified. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that non-compliance or fraud or theft or breach of fiduciary duty must have resulted in financial loss, which links to the leakages of public funds that I've been talking about, and that's what we've been raising for years. So there must be a material financial loss. Either it's there or it's likely to be there. Because we can tell you now if what we're picking up, even though the payment has not happened yet, but we can tell you that it's likely that this financial loss is going to materialize, not unless as an accounting officer, you take a decisive step in doing with it. Or there's a misuse of a material public resource, or there's substantial harm either to the public or the institution itself. That's what a material irregularity is. So in short, is where there has been a non-compliance. I think majority of the MIs that we have are around non-compliance or contravention of legislation. But whether we're picking up fraud or whether it's theft or breach of fiduciary duty, that's what must then, that's the starting point. But the point I'd like you to keep in mind is that the fact that there's a non-compliance or there's theft or breach of it, it does mean that something didn't work in the accountability ecosystem. And I'd like us to reflect on that. Because if we are going to fix it and we're going to shift the public sector culture, we need to continually reflect, what is it that didn't work in my system that allowed this non-compliance to happen? And if you talk about financial loss, we're really talking about leakages in an environment where the funds we have are limited. So we're really hoping that that's something that we can work together to stop. And obviously the loss of public resources is also something that we don't want to see, because those public resources would have been there with an objective of delivering service, and a loss of that public resource, by extension, it would mean that service is not being delivered as intended. And the substantial harm to the institution or general public, I don't necessarily want to talk about it. So when we pick it up, I did say the starting point would be to communicate that to the accounting officer. To say, we've identified this non-compliance. What we are expecting and hoping happens is that the accounting officer then responds appropriately to it. Because I spoke about the fact that the responsibilities of the accounting officer are in legislation. So the legislation is clear about what happens if there's a misconduct that is identified. What happens if there's a non-compliance that results in irregular expenditure? So the things that we are requesting are not things that the Auditor General has come up with, but is where the legislation has put measures in place to say, how do you deal with it as an accounting officer? But we have acknowledged that has not been done that way over the years. So what we'll be expecting is obviously that there's an investigation that happens to get to the root cause of why was there loss, why was the resource lost or misused, or why is there substantial harm? And part of it is that if there are people that needs to be held accountable, let's do that. Let's hold people accountable, because if there's the lack of accountability, it would drive a culture where people are just not accountable, and it will be chaotic, and it will result in all sorts of problems. But the core of it is service delivery. Now, and part of it would be, if there's been a loss, can we recover the money, right? So it's more what we're expecting is corrective action, is really the accounting officers to then implement what the legislation requires them to implement. Where the accounting officer is not responding appropriately, and the appropriateness is really not about what the AG would like to see, but is what the legislation requires. If that is not done, then it brings us to the steps that are there, step 1 and step 2. Let me start with step 2. If the accounting officer does not respond appropriately to deal with the MI, the next step is for us to then recommend what actions that needs to be taken to resolve the material irregularity. And I've been saying that the recommendations will be aligned to what the legislation requires. So what we like to see is that if these recommendations are implemented, there must be an improvement in the internal controls. Because I did say that the fact that there's a non-compliance points you to a breakdown or a lapse in internal controls. How do we make sure that we strengthen it so that it doesn't recur? Because the idea is not to pick up MIs for similar transactions year in, year out. But once we alert the accounting officer, as part of us enabling accountability, we're hoping that the accounting officer will take it in the spirit of enabling accountability and then deal with it. So if it's resolved, if our recommendations are implemented, the MI gets resolved. The impact of accounting officers implementing our recommendations is the improved environment I spoke about. The second thing is that obviously if there's money that has been lost, that money gets recovered. But also that people are held accountable to the extent that they have to, so that you drive the culture that is characterized by performance, integrity, and accountability. If unfortunately, even after we've then put those recommendations in our audit report, the accounting officer is still not responsive, it forces us to get to the next step, which is taking binding remedial action. So it's more an instruction now to say, you now must implement this recommendations, but it's really about what is it that will remedy the situation and stop it from recurring. So we'll get into the binding remedial action. I'm hoping you're starting to see that getting to recommendations and binding remedial action tells you that the accounting officer has not done anything with the MIs. So they are not complying with what the legislation requires them to. Then it forces our hands to then move to the binding remedial action. Our hope is that we don't even get there. We shouldn't even get to the recommendation stage. If we have accounting officers that partner with us in this journey, it would be an opportunity to work together strategically to ensure that there's an improvement in the lived experiences of citizens. And of course, if the binding remedial actions are not implemented and there's a financial loss, we will then get to the issuing of the certificate of debt. What I think I'd like to make clear is that ours is not really we don't want to see a lot of, or our hope is that we don't see a lot of certificate of debt. Like I said, because getting there would be indication that the accountability ecosystem that I spoke about earlier has failed dismally. And I don't think that's the right message to send to the people that are looking up to all of us, whether it's yourself as leadership and government, or also us as the supreme audit institution. Don't think that the people who are looking at us to help them to see an improvement in their lived reality would be happy to see us get there. Our success is clear that if this instrument is successful, we would not even get to certificate of debt, because it would tell you that we are identifying when first accounting officers must put preventative controls supported by senior management and the officials, must put preventative controls in place, which is the checks and balances to really make sure that we prevent errors or non-compliance from happening, detective controls to pick it up when it happened and deal with it. Ours is to say, if that has failed, if we pick up a material irregularity, we'll alert the accounting officer because we are enabling accountability. And we are then dependent on the accounting officer to then continue with that exercise. And if the accounting officer, like I've been saying, is acting appropriately, then it stops the process. I'll go to number one, which talks to the referring the material irregularities. So there are some that when we assess them, so where the accounting officer has not taken action, when we assess this material irregularity, and we look at quite a number of things, can take a decision that there are other public bodies which have their mandate and they've got a legislation that guides them, who would be best placed to deal with it. And that would be instances where there's fraud, right? So that's one of the things that we look at, or where it requires an extensive investigation that those public bodies are mandated to deal with, we'll refer to them. But there are instances where if the accounting officer themselves are involved, we then are clear that they're not going to implement our remedial action or recommendations, and then that will refer. So the next slide would to say, because the question that gets asked, if it hasn't gotten to you, is to say, but you were given these powers, you started implementing this on the 1st of April 2019. What has happened to date? This is just to give you a sense of where we are from an implementation stage. That in 2019, when we started, we only started with 25 auditees, right? Both in the MFMA and PFMA space. And we've scaled it up over the years to where in the next round, we are looking to have about 706 auditees that we would then phase in. And what I like you to note here is that, of course, when we then started selecting the earlier years of phasing in, our focus was more on the key service delivery department, the departments that had a lot of lapses, because we wanted to make sure that we focus our attention on the right ones. So as we scale it up, is more bringing more into the folds, but we would have started with the key ones. The next slide is that if we are doing so many auditees, what are we saying? And you will know that the next one, we update this thing. The intention is to update it quarterly. So the next update would be due when we would deliver the PFMA report. But that will just give you a sense of the number of MIs that we've identified. As at 15 October, which was last year, but also the latest is April 2022. So the number of auditees as well as the MIs. And if you look at the number of auditees, which is sitting at 372, and the number of MIs, it tells you that there are some auditees that don't have MIs at all, because the systems are robust enough to pick up these issues and deal with them. And some institutions are having more MIs, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean one institution, one MI, but it depends on whether we've identified the MIs. But the numbers, I think, does tell you that on average, some institutions have quite a lot. The estimated loss that we've picked up so far is about 14.7 billion. And I'd like you to reflect on that 14.7, because we know that that money can do quite a lot from a service delivery perspective. So when I spoke about preventing leakages in the system, is really about this financial loss. How do we work together to make sure that we prevent instances where there is financial loss? Because this money could have delivered services. I mean, some departments or institutions that government has don't even have a budget as big as the loss that we've picked up. And that would have been picked up in the different spheres of government, local government, the provinces, and national. There is a slide later that tells you what does the picture look like per province. That will just to give you a sense of the statistics. But what I'd like you to take from the slide is the fact that we need to find ways to work with each other as leaders of the government institution, but also ourselves as a side, to say, how do we work with each other to prevent the losses? That's the first thing. But to an extent that it has happened, how do we make sure that we recover these losses and we bring them back into the public purse so that they get channeled to service delivery? Because how we win as government and how we win as leaders is to ensure that the people who are there on the ground experience different service from government, and their needs are met to an extent that is possible. So I'd like us to reflect on the 14.7 billion with an idea of saying, if we were to recover this money, what value would it add? So we move to the next slide. And I'm drawing to a close. So this next slide, I'd like you to see the fact that these are the MIs, these are the categories of MIs that we've picked up, right? And the next slide will talk to you about where they are in the chain. Each of the buckets, whether you look at the procurement or payment, or whether you look at resource management or revenue management or interest or fraud or harm to general public or harm to the public sector or misuse of the public resource. So the last four would be the impact, the last three will be the impact element, because we talk about either the harm to general public or a loss of material resource or a harm to the public institution. And we've spoken about the non-compliance, which is the first part of it. What I'd like you to reflect on here as you go to your different environment is that take this back to the accountability ecosystem. So the first, if I take the first bucket, you talk about non-compliance with procurement processes. And if the different role players in the ecosystem had put the preventative controls, which is the checks and balances in place, made sure that there are right people in those positions, SCM being the significant one. And also you monitor this non-compliance. It could have avoided this from materializing. The impact of it is that government is now buying or getting service at very higher, higher rates, because it talks about the overpricing of goods and services procured. So that non-compliance resulted in the overpricing. This is also money that could have been used for other things. Let's reflect back to the accountability ecosystem and think about, in my institution that I'm in, if I'm to avoid having that, what are the changes that I need to make in the internal control environment? The second one look at uneconomical procurement. If we know that we have got limited funds, as the senior leadership in the various roles, it becomes important that when we procure, we then look at how do we do it in the most economical way. And that then takes us back to also the accountability ecosystem that needs to be improved. And the last one is a classic one where we're paying for service that has not been delivered. We're seeing in the build industry where government is constructing assets, where we are paying for some of the work that hasn't been done, right? And now the question that needs to be asked is, but there were role players which were tasked to monitor the project. What happened at the project management level, right? We are picking up instances where you have project managers and you've got service providers that assist in managing the projects. There are instances where they're raising concerns around either the performance of the contractor, or they're raising concerns about the time that is taking for this project to be delivered, and they're proposing recommendations in terms of how this needs to be dealt with. And you are noting instances where in some instances, the accounting officer doesn't take the right decision. And a year or two later, that service provider then abandons site. You have to get somebody else to come who is fresh, start that project. And we know that the first thing that they need to do is to quantify what is on the ground and compare it with what we've paid the service provider. And there you pick up gaps where now it will cost you more to deliver on that project. Resource management is a one that, with the right checks and balances, it mustn't even happen, because you're talking about instances where assets are not safeguarded, right? And some of the assets that we have are costing quite a lot of money. Where we talk about loss of investment, where there wasn't due care in terms of the investment. And I mean, all of it is really about what has failed in the accountability ecosystem and how do we strengthen that. The next slide is really to talk about, so I mean, yes, we still have room for improvement. There's work that needs to be done in the different spaces, but we do have instances where accounting officers have really taken this message to heart and they've responded they've taken action. And we see the impact of that action. So for example, at the Department of Water and Sanitation, so the water trading entity, there were some clients that were not being billed for water, right? And we raised that MI, and that department and the accounting officer took the corrective steps to make sure that those customers are being billed. That increases revenue, and we're also seeing it from the municipality space where you talk about billing. We've seen instances where after we've raised MIs, like a Department of DBE, the Department of Education, where we've raised an MI, it was around a service provider that was paid more for the work that has been done. And when we raised the MI, we've seen the accounting officer taking action not to pay the service provider until the investigation has been done, to then see, I mean, it's easier to withhold the payments instead of paying it and then wanting to recover it later. But obviously you'd have to make sure that that process is then followed properly from a legal perspective. And we've seen instances where some contracts have been discontinued, right? Where money has been lost. But even there, you have to follow the legal process. There's also accounting officers that have timely, they've done investigations in time. And those investigations, the quality of it is one that tells you that the accounting officer was clear on what is it that they wanted to achieve with the investigation. They were not doing it because the Auditor General is expecting a report, but because they know that from a legislative requirement perspective, they have to do the investigation. So we've seen money that is being recovered by government where accounting officers have taken action. We've seen instances where there's disciplinary hearings that have happened and there was consequence management. We acknowledge that sometimes that takes long, and I'll talk to it. But you're clear that the accounting officer is taken, and that's what we'd like to see. We really would like to see accounting officers who are supportive of the process and really, intentional about figuring out what went wrong in the system and correcting it, recovering the losses, and making sure that there's consequence management. In the municipal space, we've raised MIs on repeated disclaimers, and we've really seen on some municipalities where there's been action that has been put in place to then deal with it, right? And that's what we'd like to see. So if we are successful in this environment, we really would like to partner with accounting officers where they support us to make sure that action is being taken, the losses are recovered, there's consequence management, the internal systems are improved, and assets are safeguarded, right? We'd like to see that. And where obviously some suppliers are not giving you the value that is expected of them, we'd like to see those suppliers being dealt with from a performance management perspective. The next slide is really the one that is really unfortunate, and we're hoping that we don't get here. So these are where the accounting officer has not taken appropriate action. So you'll see a bulk of it is sitting where the accounting officer is taking appropriate action. And maybe what I want to say there is that sometimes it starts like that, where the accounting officer then commits to take appropriate action. But when we come the following year, you find that nothing much has been done. So yes, the accounting officer was receptive of the message. They made commitments to implement, do this investigation, but you get back a year later, nothing has been done, which then forces us to get to the recommendation stage. So some of it is what we will continue to follow up as we do the audit, and we're really hoping that the accounting officers honor their commitments. So we've got about 29 that are sitting at recommendation stage. Like I said, that for me, the key takeaway there is that the accountability ecosystem has failed. The accounting officer supported by the senior management did not do what they needed to do to resolve the AMI. Whether you're looking at the ones that are sitting in remedial action, it also communicates that message. I mean, some of it here, I mean, if you look at the Free State Development Corporation, which we preferred, is really about an instance where a service provider was collecting revenue on behalf of the municipality, but that revenue was never paid back to the municipality. The money that has been collected was never paid back to the municipality. Now, if you sit back and you think about, so the officials who were tasked with the responsibility to collect the money, why did they not do that? If you look at the fact that there are people who work around debtors and they do debtors collection, why did they not do that? Importantly, at the senior management level, if we know that there's this one that service provider that helps us to collect quite a significant, I think it's about 136 million, it's quite a lot. If we know that there's a service provider who's assisting us to collect this money and they're not paying it, if we are monitoring, why are we not dealing with it? So I think it takes you back to the accountability ecosystem that has failed. Or you look at the defense that is sitting at recommendations. There's some of it is about where we've leased a building and we continued to pay the building, but it wasn't occupied, right, for years. And I'm not talking about 1 month, but I'm talking about an extended period of time where if the official senior management right up to accounting officer implemented their roles and responsibility that is required in terms of legislation, that loss could have been prevented. Or if you're looking at, and I'm picking up the example so that I illustrate that the work we are asking is not work that is impossible to do. but it's really what we are expected to do on a day-to-day basis. And if we can get that right, it will assist with this journey. I won't spend time on the next slide. I think you can fly it, but it's just how the MIs are distributed throughout the provinces and what stages it's sitting in. The last slide, I think, as I draw to a close, is that we are being asked, so when do we get to certificate of debt? And I've mentioned earlier that getting to a certificate of debt will really mean that all of us have failed. The accountability ecosystem did not come to the party. And I've been illustrating that as I was going through the different slides. That timeline, let me talk to the first one when we identify. So it's more an example, just to give you a sense of how long it takes to get to certificate of debt. It's from when you identify an MI. But because we need to first give the accounting officer an opportunity to implement appropriate action, so we need to wait for that. We also need to give the accounting officer an opportunity to implement recommendations, and we need to follow up if those have been implemented. If that has not been done, you move to remedial action. So it is a process, because we want to make sure that at the end of the day, we can demonstrate administrative justice, that we are fair in the process. We've given the accounting officer all available opportunities to remedy the situation. But the political leadership as well, if we get a certificate of debt, it means that they have not played their part, because when we get to remedial action, we do update them in terms of where we are, and we ask them to assist us to get the accounting officer to implement the recommendations. What are the stumbling blocks in the process? The first one that I'd like you to support us in managing it differently is the first one, where it takes longer to finalize the investigation. And yes, I know that we could say investigations by nature take longer. But, the instances we've seen is where the delays is actually just starting, right? So just starting the process and appointing service providers to do it takes longer than necessary. And you've seen some auditees at the end saying, well, we don't have money for the investigation, we'll get our internal audit to look at it, which was an opportunity that was available from the word go, which tells you that maybe we did not think properly about how are we going to do this investigation? Do we have the resource, and who do we tap into within the entity, but also in the accountability ecosystem to assist us? And we're seeing that disciplinary processes are taking long again. Yes, we can have instances where the employees also don't avail themselves of the process, takes longer, and it's part of this disciplinary process. But I'm talking about instances where maybe there's a commitment made that disciplinary processes will be started, but that is not done for the longest of time. So most of it, what we're raising around the completion of investigation and disciplinary process is really, we're talking about the things that are within the accounting officer's control and not so much the other stuff. The biggest challenge is the stability at accounting officer level, because we would issue this MI to the accounting officer. So in the municipal space, now there's new leadership. You all know what happens there. That instability does delay us, because when somebody new comes in, you have to give them the opportunity to at least implement the corrective actions or the recommendations before we can say that they've failed. And the ones where we are referring it, and it talks about the external delays. I mean, we're seeing where accounting officers have taken it on board, and they're trying to recover the money from either the service provider or the employees, but the recoveries from the state attorneys are not necessarily as quick as we like them to be. And we're seeing a trend where some suppliers will then just go into voluntary liquidation the minute they know that there is an investigation around the payments and the work that they've done. And we're seeing that in some instances, the accounting officers don't even lodge a claim with the liquidators until it's too late, right? So yes, we might not control the fact that people go into a voluntary liquidation, but I think we can put the claim. And I think it gets me back to the fact that if we had done what we needed to do from the word go, which is the monitoring, the checks and balances, we will not get to where we have to now spend money in terms of legal costs to try and recover money and try and recover this lost funds from liquidation. And of course, there's the issue of the intergovernmental processes. My slide is to say, so what are we asking of you, which is the call to action. So we're requesting that if you are in a position to appoint people, can we ensure that we are appointing capable officials that would help us to have this culture of accountability? So we were clear earlier that the culture is important, and we would like to shift that culture. But at the center of shifting the culture is the caliber of people you have in the different positions. We would like to see a government that has normalized or institutionalized accountability. Accountability has to be one of the characteristics of the institutions that we are leading. And if you're an official around this call, our ask is really to say, you need to do your job to your best ability. So that means you need to empower yourself with the right skill. If you in a functional space, whether it's SCM or delivering service, making sure that you've got the right skills to do the work. Even if it means, we read, all of us, we keep ourselves up to date, but it's more about how do we professionalize the public space. That would be part of what the leadership will do. But as individuals employed in government, we also have a responsibility. How do we come to the party? There's that saying by Martin Luther King to say that you must do whatever you do so well that the living, the dead, and the unborn cannot do it better than you. How do we make sure that whatever we do it to our best ability? The second one is the preventative controls. So I've spoken about preventative controls, which we need to embed them in what we do on a day-to-day basis, because the preventative controls are key to the work that we do, are key to preventing fraud, to preventing errors and omissions in the system. And that those preventative controls will also include the monitoring mechanisms. And we are clear that if we can embed that, it will prevent accountability failures. And where they happen, because I said that we are not asking for perfection, where they happen, how do we deal with them appropriately to make sure that we create the right culture? People know that there has to be corrective action so that, the culture is a culture that put accountability at the center of what it does. But secondly, it means supporting. So if you see that people don't understand what you're doing, how do we then support them? The third one is really, and this one is more at the senior management leadership. If you are in a leadership of monitoring, these people that are working and under you or working with you, we need to enable and insist on regular monitoring controls, right? How do we monitor the work that is being done? Because if without that monitoring, we are none the wiser. We'll never pick up if things has changed. And I've put project management disciplines there because government is spending quite a lot of money on infrastructure. And we are seeing serious leakages of funds in infrastructure space. How do we, and it goes back to the project management disciplines. And the last one is to make sure that we lead by examples and we ensure that there's consequences for accountability failure. As I sum up my message, we are clear as an organization that we need to strategically partner with government to shift this public sector culture to one that is characterized by performance, which will then translate to service delivery and ultimately translate to better experiences. The citizens will experience, or their reality will change, and they'll experience government and us as a Chapter 9 differently. Characterized by accountability. So accountability is key. It has to be the center with what we do. Transparency and integrity. That's what we'll see. We will move a critical mass of our auditees to where they are doing good, and they have institutions that have those characteristics. And we do it through insights, influence, and enforcement. And enforcement is the unfortunate part that talks to the MI. And we are really clear that with your support, with the accountability ecosystem, if it can be properly activated, with each role player playing their part, we can have a government that delivers services to its people, and we can improve the lived experiences of citizens. And I think the next slide is just the preventative guides that are there. I think just so that One is that we have these material irregularities that have been identified, and we keep them on our website. We update them as I think quarterly. Linda, you can correct me, but I think we update it quarterly. I'd like you to spend time looking at the type of material irregularities that we've picked up, because we've got details there and also their status, because that will then empower you to make sure that you prevent that from happening in your space. And the second part is that I've been talking a lot about preventative control. So we've shared a lot of guidelines that deals with the different aspects, whether it's tone at the top and the culture that I spoke about, or institutionalizing internal controls. I spoke to that as a responsibility of senior management, preparation of financials, and the latest one is the infrastructure. If you could have access to those preventative control guides, it would really help you to do things differently and help you in ensuring that this is delivered. I'll pause there and hand back to you, Craig. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. That was a very insightful, factful, and engaging. It kept my attention. I didn't even realize how much time we spent there. But just to highlight a couple of key points that I picked up, was the root causes that you got from the Institute for Internal Auditors, the organizational culture issues, which I thought was very relevant, very, very pertinent. That organizational culture drives how business is done, and it supports the achievement of organizational objectives. I thought that was critical, because if the culture is not right, you can't get most of anything else right. Your 7-year strategy, brilliant, nicely put together, and I think the three concepts that you highlighted, again linking it back to organizational culture, insight, influence, and enforcement, which I thought was brilliantly also shared with all the participants. Key, how do we professionalize the public service officials? What do we want to see? And that is a conversation for another day. And then you try to identify or define what is an MI. What is a material irregularity? The non-compliance or contravention of legislation, fraud, theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and the misuse or loss of material public resources. I thought that was nice to put it in perspective to irregular expenditure, which is just about the financial part. Then you spoke about all these incidents of MI and how do we work with each other to prevent future MI from happening, and how do we recover the losses. It's astounding to think that it's 14.7 billion that we can recover, and in the situation that the country is in, a lot can be done with that amount of money. And then I like the last slide, which is the call to action, which speaks about 4 key things: appoint capable officials, embed accountability, have regular monitoring and project management discipline, lead by example, and ensure there's consequences for accountability for failures, which is linking to consequence management. And then, of course, sharing that the AGSA has preventative control guides to help and assist us. That was just me trying to wrap up a very, very comprehensive presentation that was presented by the head of portfolio for audit at the AGSA, Sibongile. I'm going to open the floor now for questions. I'll take about 2 rounds, I think, of 3 questions, but most of the other questions you will see our panel is responding to in the Q&A session. So we're going to have a bit of engagement for the next 15 to 20 minutes. We have a question from Nomzamo Lamula, head of portfolio. I'm going to read the question and you can respond. Earlier you spoke of commitments that are actionable. My question is, what is or what AG has done on the unspent budget that departments send back to National Treasury year in and year out. Here, departments complain every year of budget constraints. I'm going to hand that one over to you, Sibongile.
Okay, no, thank you so much, Craig, and thank you, Nomzamo, for that. I think as I was looking at the questions, I thought that was an interesting one. Look, I think I'll center it around the accountability ecosystem. If you look at some of what Nomzamo is talking about, the majority of it will be conditional grants. So these grants will be coming from National Treasury. They go, some of them, through the national department, and they then either cascade to municipalities or provinces. So what we have started doing, Nomzamo, is to look at what exactly is the root cause for the underspending. And we are doing work at the different spheres of government. So at national, for an example, we would have, so there's key service delivery departments that we started unpacking, whether it's the Department of Transport or the Department of Human Settlements, or whether it's health and education or water and sanitation. We are starting to have an engagement with the department about how are they monitoring the spending around the grants. And you find that the departments are doing different things. Others are just monitoring the spending. Are you spending? Are you not? But where there are challenges, they don't necessarily assist the municipalities or the provinces with clear actions to say, how do you then fast track the spending? But we're also picking up instances where the monitoring is not happening at all, or where there is monitoring around project management, because most of it is around project, like capital projects, that there are weaknesses around the project management, that to a large extent the funds are not being spent. And we've raised those insights. We spoke about us raising insights with recommendations, and that's what we've done with a lot of the national departments. But when you get to where the funds have to be spent, whether it's provinces or local government, we're also unpacking the reasons why. And I think most of it is around the lot of challenges around SCM processes where they are delayed. Poor planning is also coming as part of the root causes, and just the poor discipline around project management. And we are elevating those areas, Nomzamo, at both national department, at provincial department, and at local government to an extent that it's applicable to them. And we've gotten clear commitments, and ours is to then track it going forward and support the government institutions in implementing those commitments. So we're looking into it. We are elevating the gaps, the root causes. We're having conversation around that, and we're proposing some recommendations. And we are getting very good commitments from the leadership at the accounting officer level and also at the political leadership. So the next thing that is important is how do we track them and how do we start seeing the impact on the ground. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, Ms. Lubambo. Mohammed and Masachaba, I see your hands, but I'm going to just read one more question from the Q&A for our speaker to respond to. Is it true that a number of potential MIs are raised by audit teams and most of them end up not being issued year after year, as there appears to be some disagreement within the AG itself? What are the stumbling blocks faced by the AG and what can be done to ensure these are closed off effectively? Over to you, Speaker. That's from Mahuhu.
Yes, I see that. And thanks for that, Magugu. Look, I think the one thing that we are clear about, Chair, is that the MI process is not necessarily aligned to the audit cycle, right? So you can pick up potential material irregularities, or you pick up the non-compliance when you do the audit. But we still need to do work around the financial loss or the impact, right? And sometimes that will then be done after the cycle is closed, after the audit report has been issued. So we then close the cycle with potential MIs that will continue to do work on it. You'll also understand that with the MIs, by the time we issue it, we need to also be comfortable that we've got the evidence, so that there is really a loss and we have evidence to back that up, so that if an accounting officer or somebody later on challenges you, you don't scramble to try and support the assertion that there has been a material irregularity, right? And part of it is because we understand that if we were to be found wanting from a process perspective, it would have a negative impact on our reputation and by extension, on what these powers are meant to achieve. So you talk about disagreements, but what I'll talk about is really the fact that, I mean, some of the concepts are quite tricky. So if we talk about MIs where we say there's been fraud, or where we say the impact has been a substantial harm to the public or the institution itself, or where we talk about there's a breach of fiduciary duty, right? Those are complex issues that we need to deal with. And we've got processes in the organization to help us check ourselves that the conclusions we're making are correct. So there would be other processes, our technical team and our legal team will help us to get to the correct decision around the MIs. And sometimes that I must admit, it does take some time. And those robust debates, which is not so much disagreements, but it's robust engagement internally, is what strengthens our processes and strengthens the MI, the quality of the MIs that we issue. So we see it as part of the process. It's really where we are robustly engaging on how do we position these MIs? Is there really substantial harm to the, and I'm not talking on the easier ones where there's financial loss and everybody can say it, but it's more the complex ones that we're starting to get to. But you will see that a number of those MIs end up being issued, but it would be after the audit cycle. Like for now, we are still issuing MIs on the work that would either have been done by the municipality at the municipality time, the municipal auditors when they were auditing then, or even when we sign off in July, we're continuing to issue the MI. One of the things that we are also reflecting on, Makoko, is how do we then strengthen that process and make sure that they speed into it and it doesn't take long. And that I think would then close the effectiveness part of your question. So we continually have to review our processes and make sure that the instruction in how quickly do we issue the MIs, and also it's MIs that are more impactful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lubambo. I think there's two hands and they've been up for quite some time. I want to give Mohammed a chance. Mohammed Ismail, if you can just unmute yourself and pose your question, be very brief and precise, please. Thank you.
No, good afternoon, Chair. We are very patient because we are gaining a lot of knowledge from the speaker today. First of all, let me take this opportunity for this enlightening information that was given to us today. However, I have maybe first one, maybe if it can just be, is it not possible where, I know there has been checklists developed before, is it not possible to redevelop checklists between Treasury and AG, but just sort of a guide to make it easier for us as officials that works in the public sector in terms of saying, okay, bid committees, this is what you need to look out for, failure to look out for, sort of a spreadsheet. Maybe it's there, but maybe just to reissue it out again for further knowledge. And I don't know if that's possible. Number two, I just a concern from my side, what happens if you award a tender, because not everything is fraud, but what happens if there's a MI issued out, but you can clearly see there was no fraud on it. So what happens then? The debt certificate, who does it get issued out to? Because although there was no value, there was no loss, but it's just an innocent mistake from bid committee members. What do you do in that instance? And by the way, I am representing the Fleet Management Trading Entity under the Department of Police, Roads and Transport.
Thank you for that one, Mohammed.
And is it possible for us to get the presentation?
I will respond to that in the closing remarks. Thank you, Mohammed. Speaker, can I just take the last hand and then we can get responses from you? Masichaba, you can continue.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Let me thank this opportunity from NSG and also thank Head of Audit from the GSA, Ms. Lubambo. Chairperson, I just want to ask, and I think somehow in her slides, it was responded. I don't, and we are, however, let me start by saying I'm not defending the non-payment of the bulk services. it affects the institutions like ESCOM and water boards very negatively in terms of their operations and for the services which are required by the communities. And I also appreciate the fact that AG, attitude is not such that it say you didn't pay, so it's wrong. They do hear the accounting officer and look at the plans which they have to address the issue. But it could have been helped, a program director, if we could have had the separation of that 7 billion loss, just to understand what is it that is going to the government institutions like ESCOM and water boards, so that we could see what portion goes to them, which where I'm sitting and having read the reports of the AG, I would think that it's the bulk of the loss. And then the other losses which happened because of the other SCM prescripts not being adhered to, or revenue not being collected, or perhaps assets which have been lost, whatever the case may be. So that split might assist us so that we can kind of see what kind of a differentiated approach we are able to support our auditees to deal with. And then on the question of the guide, program director, there is a guide that us as treasuries have issued. And I think it's about 2 years ago, and we worked collaboratively with the Office of the AG on it, where it was guiding the AOs to deal with the matter. But perhaps because it was during the hard COVID lockdown, the distribution might have lost some way. So I will just take this comment out to the TCF, where all provinces are represented in national, so that we can redistribute that guide again, because it does make it easy for the accounting officers to deal with the MIs, and it was done collaboratively by treasuries and them as well. Chairperson, it could have been great as well if we could see how this non-payment of services, what is the impact thereof to ESCOM and the water boards as an example? Are they also now in a challenge of not meeting their debts as they fall due? And so that we can just see this full cycle. And Chairperson, where there is a loss, even though there was no criminal activity, I think that's why AG will always give us a chance to say, go and recover the loss from whoever has done an error. And only when we're not doing what we're supposed to do, it lands with us. And we really appreciate that attitude and that approach from the AGSA. Thank you for very insightful presentation, Ms. Bongile. We really appreciate it. I'm not alone. I'm with some of the HODs from Free State. I'm with the HOD for Police, Roads and Transport. So we are here listening and learning from this. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chaba. Thank you for a loaded question. Speaker, would you allow me to take Enrico, and then that's the 3 hands, then you can respond. Okay, Enrico, you may go. Mr. Chaba, can you put down your hand, please?
Thank you, Speaker, for taking my question. I'm going to be very short. My question is simple. Can you provide more clarity in terms of the legality of the Public Audit Amendment Act? In this reason being is Section 88 of the Constitution don't mention any powers on the AG to issue remedial action as it does with the Public Protector. And the AG was in a similar situation as the Public Protector. It gave recommendations, but it was not binding. But after the Nikandla judgment, the Constitutional Court said, no, the remedial action of the Public Protector is binding. So if you want to, if you have an issue with it, you have to set it aside. But the Constitution clearly states the Public Protector is remedial action, the power to issue remedial action, and it does not state the same with the AG. And our constitutional literature also indicates that the role of the Public Protector is merely to account and report and give recommendations on how public money has been spent. Thank you very much, Speaker.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Can you just put your hand down? Everybody else that have asked questions in the Q&A section, please do not think that I'm ignoring your questions. There is a panel that's responding to the questions as the webinar continues, and we've just handpicked a couple that the speaker can respond to. So all questions will eventually be responded to. And all attendees, please, before you log off, ensure that you respond to the Mentimeter questions that have been posed. Sipongile, I'm handing over to you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. I think the first question from Mohammed Masuchaba has assisted in answering that, and it's good to hear your voice, Masuchaba. I'm not seeing you. So I do take it that, Mohammed, you are covered with that one. But also Linda is on the call. Linda, I did say, is an executive that assists us with reporting and methodology. So she would have played a central role in some of these preventative guides. So we can look at how do we, I think, Mr. Chaba, you'll take it with NT in terms of how do we avail this documents or the checklist that was shared during COVID, so that if there's new people who've joined the public sector, they can access them easily. So I'll leave it with Mr. Chaba. The second part of the question about a tender that was awarded where there was no fraud, who do you issue the certificate to? Maybe let me answer it this way, Mohammed, that if you remember the definition of the material irregularity, right? The impact of this non-compliance, for it to qualify as a material irregularity, it must have resulted in a financial loss. I heard you saying, what if there's no loss? But we would not have raised it, right, if there's no loss. Not unless it meets the other impact elements. So the one is there must have been financial loss, or it's likely to result in a loss. There must be a loss to public resource or misuse, but substantial harm to the public and the public institution itself. So maybe there's no loss, but then maybe the other elements are applicable. What we would then suggest is that obviously when we raise the MI, we would then talk about what is it that the accounting officer would need to do. And part of it is let's investigate and understand why did we have the non-compliance, right? That will be one of the things that we ask. And if we believe that there are internal control gaps, significant internal control gaps, we recommend that let's put some corrective actions to strengthen the internal controls. Where there is loss, we'll ask that you recover it, either from the service provider, depending on the nature of the loss, or from the officials that would have been involved. At the end of it, the certificate of debt, if we get to that, which we're hoping we don't get to that, Mohammed, because if you say there's no fraud, it will suggest somebody has done an investigation to get to that conclusion. And it's not just looking at it in the face value and say, no, but there was no fraud. It will suggest somebody has done an investigation, and that investigation will then give you a sense of what has transpired and why did you end up with a non-compliance. And it will probably recommend how do you then course correct. So if that has not happened, the course correction, even after we've issued our recommendations and we've translated them into remedial actions, if that has not happened, then the certificate of debt will go to the accounting officer that would have failed to take action even after we've given multiple opportunities to do that. I hope that answers your question. So, Master Chaba, the part about the National Treasury, I think I've spoken to it. I do take your point around maybe we can, in the slide, I think it was slide 19, where we then unpack it to the different categories. You are indicating that it would be useful to then break down the amounts to that. I think that's something that we can look at. Maybe we'll look at whether there's an opportunity to do that improvement. And when the next time we update the website, we could consider that. So I'll note that. And then the part about what is the impact on ESCOM and the water boards. I mean, so we've recently issued the water board report. And so that was the beginning of September. And yes, that was on the 2021 year. We're planning to issue a water board report next year. That will give you a clear sense of the financial health of this water board, that some of them are struggling. We find that some are even struggling to finalize projects because of availability of funds, or they're delaying their projects because the timing of the funds that they were expecting from the municipalities did not materialize. which has a bigger impact on service delivery, because if they delay in those projects, the consequence impact of it is felt by municipalities as well, because that infrastructure by water boards, then municipality use it to deliver water. So the impact is really on the financial health, that's where you sit at the water board level, but on the lived experiences of citizens is, I mean, water is one of the resources that we need. So I think that has a dire impact to the citizens as well. I mean, the ESCOM water, I mean, we all see what's happening with the load shedding, but I think the one we've unpacked in detail, Mr. Taba, is on the water board. And I think I've covered your questions. And the interesting one from Enrico in terms of what is the legality of PAA. Look, I think we're comfortable that this is legal. So it's gone through the process of being approved at Parliament. There's been a lot of consultation when the Public Audit Act was changed. There was consultation legally inside, but also with the legal team in government, and also Parliament had their team to look at this changes. So I'm quite comfortable that one of the instruments that help us with the work that we do is our Public Audit Act. And the fact that that is there and that act had gone through the right channels, then that would be sort of how I answer that, that we can issue the remedial action. And I think maybe as I close it, is that would have been different to what we've done before. So you're right that before this changes, Enrico would not have done that, but the enhanced or extended mandate does give us those powers. So that will be the last question you had asked me to deal with here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sibongile. The rest of the questions we would respond to during within the chat. And as a good chairperson and holding to time, I have to make a few announcements and then hand over to my CFO to make these closing remarks. So in the chat, you will find there's a link to our 3 Mentimeter questions. Please spend some time to respond to them. I'll appreciate that. It gives us a sense of your feeling also about the webinar. All registered participants of this webinar will receive the speaker's presentation. So if you're registered, we'll have your email address and we will forward it to you. And then, of course, I didn't see anybody besides the speaker and myself opening up our cameras, but just to be compliant with POPIA, if your camera was on, you were giving us permission to use your picture for our marketing and other events. Just as a small marketing, at 1 o'clock today, we have another masterclass on poverty reduction, lessons learned from China, and that starts at 1 o'clock. With those few announcements made, I want to hand over to the CFO of the National School of Government, Mr. Kubele, to do some closing remarks and comments. Thank you very much. Kubele, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Mine is just to say thank you for making avail yourself, attending this webinar. I would like to thank the host, which is our speaker, Mrs. Sibongile Mulambo and her team from AG, and also the principal of the National School of Government to give us the opportunity to host this webinar, as we've learned from Ms. Sibongile in terms of what is it that we learn in terms of the webinar that was done today, which is around issues of organizational culture, which is about us as government officials. How then do we do in terms of accountability around compliance, around consequence management, and then also ensuring that there is enforcement, the role that we play as officials, also including the issue around the oversight that we get, and then also the issue that it was highlighted, which is the theory of change. what are we doing about it? How then do we change the processes so that there is that compliance at the end of the day, and then we ensuring that our citizens are the ones actually that are benefiting from the whole process. And then also I would like to thank the NSG team to ensuring that this webinar, it becomes a success. But I can't forget the people who participated in this webinar, which is all of us, the participants, and listening into this one. So thank you, and we're looking forward to see you again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, CFO. Thank you very much, Sibongile. Thank you, everybody on the panel, and thank you, everybody that honored our invitation with registration. The webinar is closed. Goodbye.
Thank
you, Sibongile.